Welcome everybody to the last session of the day. It's called The Art of Extinction. My name is Ernst Gerhardt. I'm in the English department here at Laurentian, and I'm very excited to be the chair of this session. It looks to be quite an exciting one. First on tap is Joshua Schuster, an assistant professor at Western University in the Department of English there. His research focuses on American literature and environmental ideas. In his forthcoming book, The Ecology of Modernism, American Environments and the Avant-Garde, explores the relationships between modernist American literature, music, and the environmental problems of the first half of the 20th century. Also, he's published on a variety of other topics, including Edward Brzezinski's Photography of Ecology, William Carlos Williams' Anthropological Imaginary, The Moral Fable and Animal Studies, and Arakawa and Gin's Architectural Body. Most recently, he's begun work on a new book, tentatively titled What is Extinction? A Cultural and Natural History of Last Animals, in which he discusses the literary, philosophical, and psychological implications of the extinction of animals. His lecture this afternoon is titled The Photography of Last Animals, and I invite you to welcome with me Joshua Schuster.
Thank you again to the organizers for such an incredible event. Okay, so the emergence of a science of extinction in the 19th century occurred at the same time as the emergence of documentary technologies, including photography. Today I want to look at how some of the early photographs of the bison depict the extinction of the animal as it was happening. The imagery of the plains bison, which it's also called a buffalo, it's not the buffalo genus, but it's just traditionally called. So I'll use them somewhat interchangeably today. So the imagery of the plains bison prior to the arrival of photography in the Midwest mostly shows the animal's incredible abundance and dashing pursuit by Native American or white frontier hunters. Perhaps the most common visual trope of the bison in the mid-1800s is of the stampede, the huge rolling, moving mass of bison thundering across the plains. These images will become indelible invitations to romance the frontier as ever open, teeming with the massive mammal, beckoning the hardy hunter and homesteader. The bison, the largest living land animal on the continent, males average over 2,000 pounds, appears to be limitless in number and unlimited in its exposure to the human gaze. Recent estimates as to the number of bison on the plains between around 1840 and 1860 indicate a population of approximately 30 million. I'll come back to this image a little later, but just to show a poster from 1869, where you see the huge abundance of the buffalo. One last image, just discussing the mass. So when photography of the North American plains begins to become a genre of its own after the American Civil War, the photograph of the bison will be constrained to depict a very different figure. Photographs of bison herds on the move are either extremely rare or non-existent. I would actually say non-existent. I have yet to find a single image of a bison herd prior to the 1890s. So this is due to a variety of factors, including the rarity of photographers living on the plains, the preference for static shots of landscapes and portraits, the fact that the wet collodion process, commonly used up until the early 1880s, required a small and fragile lab of chemicals to be carried with the camera, hampering the photographer's mobility. All of these factors contribute to the unlikely prospect that a photographer would encounter a bison stampede, let alone with a camera that was technologically sophisticated enough to take a picture of a moving animal. Instead, bison photography in the 19th century overwhelmingly shows the animal already isolated and killed. The current visual trope of the static bison, whether being hunted, 82, skinned, dried, or skinned, dried, taxidermied. This is a stereoscope image. These are popular. They sell really well in sort of the 1870s, 1880s. sort of taxidermy image of the train station in Kansas City. Okay, so all these images seem to slant towards depicting the inevitability of killing. Some of these images stress the subjugation and humiliation of the massive animal before human onlookers, putting the already killed animal in a position of further submission. Others imply, in their portrayal of placid, quiet scenes with an air of the pastoral, like this one, in which an animal tenderly lies at the foot of the image, that the animal appeared to go quietly and contentedly to its destruction. In almost all of these images, the killed animal is tipped over on its side or back. Just another one. Without its footing, the animal is shown, and in every one of these photographs is already defeated. However, another common visualization of the animal, beginning in 1870s photography, concerns the animal's abundance as commodity form, its skin and bones stacked for monetary gain. Echoing in inverted form the tropes of animal plenitude in paintings from earlier century, these photographs again emphasize the static object-like quality of the animal, but this time in a collective mass form. So what we see in these photographs of the small and large-scale operations in the killing of the bison is the meeting of images, the vanishing of the bison, and the spread of the outdoor industrial animal rendering economy. Both types of the bison photograph reveal scenes of the organized division of labor that will feed large-scale economies of animal goods. The visual culture of the mass processing of the animal body as lifeless, stackable good evokes in contrastive form the paintings of the bison flowing from the hills en masse. The visual power of thundering animals is mirrored in negative. This last shot. It's mirrored in negative with the visual power and soundless presence of an empire of bones. I'm going to come back to this shot and talk for a while, and there's a pair shot with this one as well. So this talk is about the intertwining of bison imagery and bison slaughter, as it offers a nexus of materials that index an early historical moment of becoming self-conscious about extinction. What does it mean then to watch extinction as it happens, and to document that watching? The photography of last animals plays a key role in the development of a public culture around animal finitude. In this talk, I will be discussing a recognizable visual trope in photography that can be called the extinction shot, defined as the many ways of attempting to visually capture the last animal of a species. But first, to tell the story of the emergence of a widespread awareness of the meanings of extinction, I need to go back to describe some of the early debates around scientific veracity of permanent species laws. In the opening decades of the 19th century, the two primary sources of knowledge concerning the history of the spread of animal life across the globe were gained from live animal observation and paleontological research. In the first decades of the 1800s, the French naturalist Georges Cuvier began a systematic analysis of how the fossil record correlated with geological strata. On the Earth's surface, he found vertebrate mammal fossils that did not correspond to existing mammals in the same class, most famously the mammoth. As he dug deeper into the strata, in older tertiary rocks were lodged fossils of mammals with no living anatomical correlate. In the older secondary rocks, Cuvier found no mammals at all, only bizarre reptiles. Aligning the oldest fossils up through more recent fossils, Cuvier noted wholesale shifts in the class of species, providing the first evidence of mass extinctions, and suggesting a theory of catastrophism to explain such sweeping events. But just rethinking when I was about this paper, it shows me that sort of mass extinction was almost the first idea of extinction. Charles Lyell, in the second volume of Principles of Geology from 1832, argued that extinction was not rare or due to catastrophes, but entirely normative, part of what he called, quote, the regular and constant order of nature. Lyell also considered that the rise in one species, quote, must in like manner have marked its progress by the diminution or the entire extirpation of some other. By the 1840s, several natural scientists began to consider how human factors had contributed to the relatively recent extinction of the dodo and other animals. So when Darwin wrote on the origin of species in the 1850s, the science of extinction had already achieved some stature and consensus regarding the mechanisms and permanence of extinction. What Darwin added was an emphasis on theories developed out of real-time observation of animal behavior amidst, quote, many complex contingencies on which the existence of each species depends. Darwin's modeling provided the basis for being able to watch and document extinction live, as it were. He saw human-induced extinction events as no different in kind than other forms of extinction. Moreover, anthropogenically caused extinction provided a model to understand how extinction occurred elsewhere. Darwin argued for a view of extinction that was empirical and causal through and through, whether the animal's disappearance was intentional or not. To quote Darwin, it says, "We see in many cases in the more recent tertiary formations that rarity precedes extinction, and we know that this has been the progress of events with those animals which have been exterminated, either locally or wholly, through man's agency." Darwin's "we see and we know," quoting his words, emphasized that rarity and extinction can now be watched, recorded, and understood as it happens. Although Darwin points to a few specific cases of extinction, naming ammonites, for example, he provides no narrative account of the death of any one species in depth. Yet in Darwin's lifetime, a new genre of writing had emerged, what can be called the narrative of the last animal, that had become increasingly nuanced by the time he wrote on the origin of species. Last animal stories, which can be fictional or non-fictional natural history accounts, document the decline and end of a species. So early examples would include Hugh Strickland's non-fictional The Dodo and Its Kindred from 1848. But in fiction, I would point to Cousin de Granville's The Last Man from 1805, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, and The Last Man, 1826, and James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, 1826. As species numbers decrease into single digits, certain tropes and narrative quandaries come to the fore that give the genre of the last animal its defining characteristics, such as what traces or memories will the last species leave on Earth? How will the last species cope with the urgency or the failure to reproduce? Does the last species know it is the last? Are humans aware of the finality of the species and the potential role in its destruction? Is it possible to stop an animal from becoming extinct, and what are the reasons why one should or should not want to do so? Simply put, extinction is not thinkable without the last animal trope. The development and adaptation of this trope is part of the way we have become self-aware of extinction, but it has also defined the parameters, assumptions, and limits of our knowledge of biological finitude. In the genre of the last animal, one sees a convergence of real-time thinking and narrating of the biology of small numbers, intertwined with issues of politics, economics, ecology, technology, and aesthetics. Looking closer at how last animal tropes are established, we can study how public attention and self-consciousness regarding extinction emerged just after Darwin's book detailed a variety of what can be called scenes of speciation. The science and narrative conventions around last animals help to frame how the depletion of the plains bison was documented and reflected upon by those directly or indirectly participating in the animal's disappearance. So I'll get to this picture in a sec. As previously mentioned, the numbers of bison roaming the North American plains in the 1840s remains hard to determine, but most agree that its population of approximately 30 million could be supported by the food available in the remaining native range, which you see here stretching from Texas up to the northern reaches of Alberta, between the Rockies and the Mississippi River. That's about 1840s already, the restrictions is smaller. By that decade, the number of Native American tribes subsisting on the bison for food and clothing had increased due to forced migration to the plains. Still, there was little noticeable change in the overall ecology of the bison until after the Civil War. Along with more accurate and quick-firing rifles, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S. beginning in the 1870s would be the key technological development that would permit hunting for bison robes to occur at a mass industrial scale. Between 1872 and 1874, the total shipment of buffalo robes to the east numbered approximately 1.4 million. And it is said that for every hide sent, there was about 5 failed sort of attempts to obtain the hide. In Dodge City, Kansas, image well known, initially the capital of the hide trade, the largest hide dealer in 1872, shipped over 200,000 hides in 1 year. The historian, so how does this work exactly? So a good hunter with a small team of dressers could kill 50 bison a day. And some claim to kill more. During the herding season in late summer, the only time when bison would congregate en masse, in a period of 3 months, a hunting team could amass 2,250 hides. There were several thousand hunters in each state, plus Native American tribes which participated in the hunt for their own livelihood or to sell robes on the market. The bison slaughter was both astounding in terms of scale and speed, executed by a relatively small number of participants spread in small hunting camps and tied into a global supply chain. New tanning techniques were invented in the mid-1870s that made bison hides, previously stiff and heavy, into more supple and versatile leathers. In addition to supplying material for clothing and furniture, one of the main uses of this leather was for belting, that was highly desired by industrialists for increasingly complex wheel and roller systems in the burgeoning factory assembly line. The slaughter of the bison happened too quickly to bother gathering the meat of the animal in most cases. This is from a similar photograph that the photographer we saw earlier. It's just showing a sort of hide trader taking the tongue and the hide only. The meat was left on the corpse and prompted a flourishing in the predatory population, particularly wolves, which in turn led to further bison depletion. Just for knowledge, a bull carcass can yield on average 550 pounds of meat. In the southern Midwest states, a collapse in bison numbers was apparent by 1875. In the northern states and Canada, hunters harvested several hundred thousand robes consistently up until 1883, when the numbers of bison hides shipped by train dropped significantly. By 1884, the hunt was over. Fewer than 1,000 bison remained, with a small herd situated in Yellowstone National Park, which forbade hunting, and on a few isolated ranchers. So the political, economic, and ecological factors that caused the near extinction of the bison have been well documented by historians and biologists. Also well known is the drive to save and protect the bison, which was led at local levels by a few isolated herdsmen, and at a national level in particular by William Hornaday, who worked for the Smithsonian and established a small preserve for the animal at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. in the late 1880s. What I'm interested in particular here is analyzing how the trope of the last bison began to be established as a biological and political concern in the context of the U.S. government intention of populating the Midwest with ranchers and homesteaders, while further confining and pacifying many Native American tribes living on reservations and scattered in settlements in the plains. The expansion of the hide trade in North America at industrial capitalist scales converged with the political practice of removing and sequestering Native Americans who depended on the animal for survival. So this is known, but I'll get to why this is important for some of these images in a minute. All right, so by the early 1870s, U.S. government officials were well aware that the numbers of the bison were diminishing and made political calculations based on the knowledge that extinction was more than likely. Secretary of the Interior under President Ulysses Grant and Columbus Delano declared, quote, "I would not seriously regret the total disappearance of the buffalo from our western prairies in its effect upon the Indians, but would regard it rather as a means of hastening their sense of dependence upon the products of the soil and their own labor." To this end, the U.S. government provided free ammunition to buffalo hunters, while Grant pocket vetoed a bill passed by the House and Senate to extend federal protection to the animal by making it illegal for anyone other than an Indian to kill a female buffalo. Debating the bill, Congressman James A. Garfield went on record saying that he would rejoice when the last buffalo was exterminated. The decimation of the bison marks the first time in history, I would argue, that animal extinction was witnessed and debated in real time, deliberated over by politicians, hunting enthusiasts, animal cruelty patrons, conservationists, and supporters and detractors of Native Americans on the plains. Belief reigned among many political and military leaders that the battle on the plains was the last salvo of an epical racial war between settler whites and Indians. In 1866, after several attacks on the plains, Generals William Sherman and Ulysses Grant urged Congress, quote, "to provide means and troops to carry on formidable hostilities against the Indians until all Indians or all the whites on the Great Plains between the settlements on the Missouri and the Pacific are exterminated." So a politics of eradication of Native Americans lined up with the eradication of all bison, which were incompatible with homestead farming and ranching that would take over the plains and quickly turn it into America's breadbasket. The extinction of the bison was condoning this perceived race war over land sovereignty that extended into food sovereignty. So there's a complex network of biological forces behind the perception of the inevitability of the last bison. What is unique about this particular extinction event is how conscious its actors were in the scale and permanency of their actions, and the interest in documenting and reflecting on extinction by these same actors. As early as 1843, John J. Audubon warned that, quote, "like the great auk, before many years the buffalo will vanish. Surely this should not be permitted." So that's 1843. Harvard zoologist Joel Allen, in an extensive 1876 study of the species, declared, quote, "the period of extinction will soon be reached." Tropes of the vanishing buffalo already circulated at the same time as the visual culture of the massive herds tumbling dramatically across the landscape. Even in the 1870s, as transcontinental trains brought tourists, homesteaders, and sport hunters into the Midwest and brought bison hides back out, these two tropes circulated within each other. So if you look back at this image, there's a kind of ecotourism in the background. We have the train sort of extending into the horizon, and the buffalo's still there, buffalo at home. But we have the buffalo skulls. So we have a mix between the buffalo being there and the disappearing and sort of the train in the midst of all this. So that's from 1869. In 1871, for example, another observer wrote that the whole country appeared one mass of buffalo. So this also led to several of these kinds of images. And this appears in Harper's Weekly, published, and it shows us a vision of animal plenty, yet at the same time, blatantly pointed out that such herds were exposed to mass killing and wastage as they were seen incompatible with modernity. Just to get people shooting from the train and have no interest in actually even collecting the robes here. So I want to compare this image, there's another one, to this image. This is also published in Harper's Weekly. It's a drawing by Thomas Nast, captioned The Last Buffalo from 1874. Here we see a lone bison giving up his robe as a kind of appeasement and surrender to the hunter. The bison keeps its head and its body, but gives its hide up to the insatiable hunter, who stands shocked but holds on to his gun. This act of submission and acceptance to human domination over the animal is one version of the last animal trope, emphasizing the fatigue and humiliation of the animal's last days. The bison has no more fight in him and strips himself in order to save himself. This image of the last animal stresses what Giorgio Agamben calls, quote, bare life, a figure stripped of all social being and reduced to the thinnest of life, mere existence. So Agamben applies this term bare life only to human lives that have been determined in the harshest of political circumstances to be lives not worth living, which leaves such life outside of any political categories, yet all the more subject to politically sanctioned violence. So the figure of bare life and the figure of the last animal eerily resonate with each other, as the last animal is the culmination of treating the animal as expendable up until the final remaining species, which suddenly takes on enormous significance that was not present in the species en masse, or individual animal just in general. The last animal is revealed as bare species, as is dramatized in Nast's Last Buffalo, a figure of horror tied to complete sacrifice, which confronts both hunter and viewer with its merits of life. So Nicole Shupin, in her powerful book Animal Capital, Rendering Life in Biopolitical Times from 2009, identifies how the bare life of animals intersects with their treatment as biopolitical object, a capitalized commodity. Shupin focuses in particular on how the historical development of animal rendering has undergirded capitalist practices of transforming the material body of animals into symbolic and abstract forms of exchange value. She further analyzes how the history of industrial-scale animal rendering is tied into the history of magnetic rendering, that is, the act of producing a copy, typically an image, such as a photograph or film. The most direct example of the intersection of these two rendering practices were slaughterhouses at the turn of the century that often invited spectators to come watch the process happen in real time. Animals are rendered on the slaughterhouse floor and then also rendered again by spectators consuming the animal visually. Shupin calls for an analysis then of, quote, the interimplication of representational and economic logics, whereby capital becomes animal and animals become capital. All right, so the near extinction of bison paved the way for the emergence of the modern meat industry and rendering operations around cattle herding in the Midwest. The bison body in its time also served as a useful object in the render economy itself. So I'm now going to return to these astonishing photographs of bison skulls. What we are seeing here is a day in the life of a rendering plant, the Michigan Carbon Works in Detroit, probably in 1895. This date is over a decade after the collapse of the bison population, but it marks the high point of the trade in bison bones that flourished in the wake of the animal's disappearance. Many newly arrived homesteaders from the plains were able to amass a not insignificant amount of starting capital by gleaning the bones of the bison left on their property. These bones were collected in warehouses at train depots and shipped by the ton to processing plants. The bones could be made into bone black, which involved baking the bones into a charcoal used for filtering sucrose syrups and in sugar refining, and bone char, a phosphate and calcium-rich fertilizer for soil. The Michigan Carbon Works was one of several processing plants specializing in such products. expanded rapidly in the 1880s and early 1890s to become one of the largest industrial plants in Detroit. By 1892, the plant covered 100 acres of land, employing 750 persons, producing over 20,000 tons of fertilizer annually. So I'll come back to both of these images in a minute. But I went to Detroit to look at some of these original images and to see what I could find out about the history of these images. While I was there, I found this drawing with Michigan Carbon Works. So then I tried to sort of compare, right, where am I in these images? Can I see the smokestack? I couldn't figure really where this pile would be located. I just assumed it's in the middle there, of that space. All right. Looking at the Michigan Carbon Works. One is immediately thrown in the scale of the image, in the midst of which many questions beg to be asked. Who are the people in the photograph? Who took the photograph? Who saw this photograph, and where was it circulated? Most of all, what are we seeing and why? What exactly is this a photograph of? Let us begin with the remarkable orderliness of the pile. The skulls have been carefully and skillfully arranged to form a wall that slopes like the base of a pyramid. The position of the two human figures gives us a sense of scale. They are dwarfed by the pile, but also allow the viewer to get a sense of its size, which appears over 20 feet high. The pile takes up nearly the whole visual space of the photograph. The orderliness of the pile, the scale, and the choice of the photographer to shoot from below, with the bones taking up nearly all the space of the image, emphasize specific aesthetic details. But we are not looking at a photograph intended to be a strictly aesthetic object, such as a landscape photograph. There is an obvious economic purpose to this image, which advertises the fortune and capacity of this corporation. Yet overlapping with the economic value of this image is the aesthetic sense of formal composition, achievement of the sublime, and framing of sheer spectacle. So there's clearly an aesthetic investment in this, whatever this is for. From the symmetrical repetitiveness of the stacked bones, our eye is interrupted by two men, one at the foot and one at the top of the pile. One of the men in this photograph is presumably Deming Jarvis, the president of the company during this period. Both men stand with one foot raised on top of a bison skull. The meaning of this stance is unmistakable. They are posing in the familiar gesture of the trophy shot, where typically a hunter stands on or next to his kill. Matthew Brower, in his book Developing Animals, points to how the same techniques and strategies used in hunting were deployed in photographing animals. The trophy shot indexes the direct convergence of these two means of capturing the animal. The genre of the trophy shot follows a consistent visual logic. The hunter is shown next to his kill, gun in hand, staring at the prize or camera, displaying the animal as testimony. So here's some trophy shots of bison. These men, all right. Come back to this pile again. So these men take obvious efforts to look confident and triumphant behind the enormous wall of bison skulls, numbering the tens of thousands. However, some aspects complicate this image as a trophy shot, since the men are not hunting. These bones were bought, and moreover, we can make out no specific individual animal or narrative of pursuit and capture. Yet the triumphant gesture of the man is unmistakable. The trophy here is the incredible proportions of the bone pile ready to be converted into capital. The photographer of the Michigan Carbon Works is unknown. The intended destination of this photograph is hard to prove. Maybe it was used by the president of the company, maybe hung in an office. Eventually, it was obtained by a collector of photographs of Michigan that was donated to the archives of the Historic Public Library. Upon further inspection of the photograph, one notices evidence of the size of the rendering plant, with large smokestacks in the background, warehouse in the distance, and train tracks in the foreground. These trappings of industrial modernity date the image as contemporary to the burgeoning development of assembly line manufacturing, even as the bone pile has the aura of something primitive, almost cultic. The power of this image comes in part from its very allusions to normalcy and marketplace efficiency. The bones are neatly stacked, not as ritual fetish objects, and not as collector's items, but placed in orderly fashion to make the pile more stable, accountable, and ready for processing. The comportment of the men is of satisfaction. They do not show expressions of the sublime, and they are certainly not mourning the end of the bison. When we look at this photograph today, it is the very calmness and orderliness that becomes so searing. The photograph is dizzying with the scale of death, yet also depicts business as usual. It is both shockingly jaw-dropping and exemplary of everyday practices of rendering bones into capital. The image is haunting and celebratory, violent and static, overpowering and oblivious, mass graveyard and junkyard. While this photograph combines tropes of aesthetic landscape photography with economic corporate imaging in the trophy shot, it also cannot be understood without the context of previous bison imagery. With the massive bison herds and the trope of the last bison. So the trophy shot here then intersects with what can be called the extinction shot. Extinction shots are the visual evidence of last animals and create a visual culture around the last animal figure. It typically shows a single animal, said to be the last of its kind. The animal is both an individual and representative of the species, yet in a sense is also neither, because the animal is seen as already vanished since no mate will be found. Extinction shots shift the individual to the status of icon for the lost species. This icon is then circulated as the witnessing of an extinction event in real time and becomes a locus where discourses of care, grief, regret, blame, and salvation erupt at extremely intense levels. What qualifies an animal photograph as an extinction shot can vary to the degree that the image circulates in the context of knowledge and self-awareness about the extinction of the animal in question. The notion of the importance of recording the last animal with visual technology, either by photograph or film, became an identifiable historical object of desire as animal photography developed in the late 19th century. The use of the camera to document last animals, whether in the wild or in captivity, has become essential to recording and authenticating the lives and numbers of last animals for scientific purposes, but also for spreading awareness of to the wider public of the animal's imminent loss. In the late 20th century, especially in recent years, the practice of last animal photography and the genre of extinction shot have proliferated. So the photograph of the bison pile is not the typical form of the extinction shot, but it still contributes to the visual culture of extinction. So if you Google bison extinction, you're likely to see this image very quickly. The man in the photograph and the photographer know the bison has vanished. The man are standing on what is probably the largest pile of bone that had ever been photographed up to that point. This is an extinction shot, but if one looks through the gaze of the hired men, this is not a photograph of a mass open-air grave. Yet it is also objectively such a depiction. Given the allusion to the mass grave, one is tempted then to ask, is this a photograph of an atrocity? J. Prosser, in his discussion of atrocity photographs, defines atrocity as, quote, an extreme violation and an inhumane act. Prosser remarks that atrocity photographs can show direct images of suffering, torture, death, and desecration, but can also find ways to indirectly convey the same. Prosser adds that, quote, photography of atrocity challenges the integrity of the human. So I would ask, can photographs of animal suffering, torture, death, and desecration be understood as pictures of atrocity? How does the concept of atrocity involve challenges to what Prosser calls the integrity of the human that are implicated with challenges to the integrity of the animal and the human-animal divide? To answer these questions with any justice would require much longer discussion than I can provide here, although I do believe the reproducibility of 19th century images of mass animal killing from hunting or harvesting remains plays a significant role in preparing spectators to visually comprehend mass graves of humans photographed in the 20th century. What I can mention here is some further evidence of how the last buffalo circulated with clear intent. The message of the buffalo was about to dispute was used directly to entice visitors and hunters to the plains in the 1880s. I'm just going to skip to this odd image of the last buffalo hunt to be held in North America. And then this one, Geronimo's last buffalo. This is a photograph in 1905 of an event where Geronimo, at the age of 80, was called to reenact the Indian buffalo hunt. After protests were raised by bison conservationists, the hunt was permitted to occur with only one aging buffalo being pursued. Some 65,000 paying customers came to watch. Geronimo shot high and did not kill the animal, which had to be finished by a helper. Geronimo was called upon to kill the bison, not to save it, thereby representing for audience consumption a kind of saving moment for his own lost indigenous way of life, while validating the double national desire to erase and consecrate, remove and care, destroy and preserve these last animals. All right. The intentional eradication of a species and the perpetuation of small numbers of last animals exemplify biopolitical practices in an age when extinction has become a quantifiable, self-reflexive science. What I want to emphasize regarding the relationship of biopolitics and extinction is the complexity of decisions, technologies, knowledges, and the actors that are involved in last animals and contribute to becoming self-aware about extinction. Furthermore, to be self-conscious about extinction and to act on that awareness, to be able to view extinction as a possible outcome, and therefore a kind of political technology, this already entails that extinction becomes a calculable and manipulable variable of species, something one can measure, mark, speed up, slow down, which is largely what we've been talking about today. But as these issues around measuring last animals become intensified, this in turn intensifies the political interest in these last numbers, and then the cycle repeats. We have come to understand more and more that biological thresholds are political thresholds in our world. Last animal imagery contributes to and is made legible in this political matrix of looking. Images of last animals become powerful documents in self-reflection on extinction. For example, recent attempts to de-extinct the quagga, Tasmanian tiger, and passenger pigeon relied heavily on drawing attention, information, and desire for such work by circulating last animal images. So you're all probably familiar with this photograph, these two photographs of a quagga, and I don't know if you're aware that there's a de-extinction quagga project where someone has tried to mate zebras with who have genes that express no stripes on the back of the body, and the idea is that, well, if you keep this sort of, I guess, recessive gene, it'll look for more and more like a quagga. So that's the point. The visual return would be de-extinction style. So I don't know, what does this have to do with science? What I'm saying. I'm not in a position to respond to that. Although I would say that I was just thinking about how much, I noticed that the IUCN requires 50 years of looking, sort of evidence, visual evidence, to build a confirmation for extinction. And this just feeds more of this culture around visual questions. Last animal witnessing, the one who witnesses the last animal, and sort of this kind of fits into this framework that I'm talking about. Because the last animal trope today draws so much attention, it is now expected that extensive documentation, especially at the visual level, will occur for endangered animals. I want to turn now, just in sort of finishing here, to one recent example of this work, the photographs of Joel Sartori, sponsored by National Geographic and collected in his book Rare, Portraits of America's Endangered Species. In the foreword to this book, Sartori tells of making the photograph of the last Columbian Basin Pygmy rabbit. Here, quoting Sartori, in an off-exhibit room at the Oregon Zoo, the staff was quiet, even reverent, as they brought in Bryn. She was one of 2 Columbia Basin Pygmy rabbits left, and since both were old females, this was a solemn occasion. The keeper placed her gently on my velvet background, and I began to take photos. I have stopped to watch her from time to time, but she didn't move much. She wasn't even scared. Nearly blind, missing half an ear, and with fur falling out on the cloth, she seemed to have already given up. The whole experience left me morose and extremely disappointed. We'd done it again, this time by converting stage habitat to agriculture in western Washington. Our photo session was one of the last chances Bryn had to be noticed. She died a few months later, and then Rafaela, the last of the breed, died as well. The Columbia Basin Pygmy rabbit is now extinct, passenger pigeon for the 21st century. All right, so Sartori's use of the language of inevitability, such as already given up, his evocation of melancholy, and his account of the relentless advance of modernity here repeat the same discourse used with regard to the bison. Sartori's story, however, also reveals another common trope of the last animal. It gets to have a name, whereas mass animals, unless they are domesticated, usually do not. So think of Martha, the last passenger pigeon, maybe the only ever named passenger pigeon. So in Sartori's photographs, the trophy shot and extinction shot, again, are combined unmistakably. To see the animals better, Sartori puts a white or black sheet behind them. Most of the photographs highlight the animal individually, while a few capture pairs or small numbers. In his personal comments on the photographs included in the book, Sartori repeatedly mentions the difficulty of getting the animal to stay still enough to be photographed with such an artificial backdrop. So here's a picture of a Wolverine. He writes, the animal proceeded to delicately walk across many times this thin sheet of paper to get its picture taken. Wolverines are a walking contradiction, he writes. Right, so in Sartori's telling, this animal sort of seems to consent to have its image taken by staying still here. By focusing on the individual animal, Sartori is trying to give these animals a sense of a face and a name, but he achieves this by intentionally eliminating any sense of the habitat and current life conditions of the animal. The black and white backdrops and the anecdotal stories are used to emphasize the animal's personal character and make them more visible at the cost of putting these animals in a non-space, an image space, which further emphasizes their isolation and last status. So just floating around the internet, I saw this picture, so this is how this process works. What we see in these photographs are what we call non-spaces, perpetual enclosures of last animals. Technologies of visibility and affective investments are all intertwined. All right, and there's just one last image from him. I'll go for it. All right, so I'd like to make one last statement in closing about how becoming self-reflexive about extinction has led to what I would identify as a constant bifurcation between accounts of last animals and last humans. So we haven't really talked about human extinction today much, but my talk focused only on last animals. In much of the cultural production around biological finitude, the discourse of last animals is strikingly divergent from the discourse of last humans. In last animal narratives, the single animal is mourned, and the reader is asked to pause in a melancholy mode over the dormant species, yet modernity continues unabated. In last man narratives, last human film, apocalypse films and whatnot, the planet is already under vast turmoil. Modernity has collapsed, and the future is deemed unimaginable because uninhabitable for humans. Last animals are figured as collateral damage of a world driven by capitalist expansion and development, and are cast often as regretful casualties or as warnings against the excesses of human control. Their rarefication reinforces existing value systems and the economic logic of scarcity. Each has the invite responses that can range from mourning to the comic or the analytic. The last human figures cast off entire structures of valuing, knowing, and being, and appear to foretell the collapse of the category of the conscious subject altogether. Whereas last animals would still leave norms intact, last humans show normative conditions and shatters. In most accounts of extinction, the discourse of last animals and last humans are kept wholly separate. But in recent years, there has been some interest in challenging these assumptions. So I throw all this in because I point with much admiration to Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, which we're moments away from hearing, where last animals and last humans read each other's fates into each other with abandon and abundance.
All right, we have time for some questions. There's one right here.
Thanks, Joshua. That was an extremely disturbing presentation.
Sorry to disturb.
I offer as praise. I do want to acknowledge that it was extremely disturbing.
Yeah.
It was very disturbing to
Yeah.
So I just have a little comment and then a question. My little comment is, I think you would find the human-animal parallels in the discourse of the last tribe, or like Ishi,
Sure.
the last of his world. So I think those parallels really are parallels and very interesting to pursue. I have a zillion questions, but I'll confine myself to one. In your very first slide, which is that painting, it's got the skull in the foreground, but the buffalo almost appears to be looking at it. If we could look at that again, it would be very obvious. And it really reminded me, and I wanted to ask you to just discuss it a little bit, of the kind of alas poor Yorick genre of seeing, of awareness of death that I found quite startling. It's replicated in the second one, but it's more interesting in that one. Yeah, the second one must be completely copied off the first thing.
Yeah, this is William Hayes is very well known.
There's something to that being right from that, like.
Yes, I've seen also very odd images of buffalo hunts where someone is behind that dead buffalo shooting the other buffalo, sort of using it as a blind. So you see sometimes the sort of memento mori image come up, and this is to sort of hit the viewer something different than the other. I don't know. Could be.
But it is interesting the way the buffalo is turning towards it. It's just implying an intentionality or something.
There's something very interesting that suddenly makes me think of, because I was just reading I've heard many sort of ecological accounts of buffalo. One recent one that was saying that bison have a concept of death and mourning, and so a bison will, of a family will return to a site of previous family's death and sort of linger there. So there's a lot of evidence of this in Yellowstone, and so that could sort of implicitly in that image. I don't know. There's something to that.
There's a question here.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Given the concept, I'm actually really interested in this real-time watching extinction as it happens, and it makes me think of the rhino right now in Africa and how there are so many images going on. Rhino being killed more and more, and they are essentially extremely disturbing as well. And given the issue of time, which I think extinction is essentially very much rooted in, and the fact that there is so much power in image and discourse to create, how can we use images, especially the fact that they can be propagated so quickly now with social media, and that discourses can be propagated very quickly as well? How can we use the images and watching real-time extinction to inform, extinction over time?
I mean, that's the greatest question. I know that people look even at that photograph in different ways. The poacher, the person, the national park context in which that might have occurred. People see it and see different things. Not everybody sees sort of the violence per se. I mean, I think in critical observatory, I think I'm a bit disappointed in those photographs, and they're very, very widespread, and he's well known. There's many well-known cases of, photographers who do last animal photography sort of as a profession, and some are really into this, so just sort of trying to get a grasp of that, and think, half of me says, why are we looking so concentratedly? What does that tell us about us? And the other half of me says, well, of course we should be looking. This is what we just sat, through, and we've been thinking about, scientists exactly knowing how much and what numbers and such like that. So I just want to understand why we're going to always look and want to look more and more, but we have to understand the cultural implications of that looking as much as, if you will, scientific implications of that looking. And so sometimes some photographs will probably disturb us more and maybe do more political action than others. I just don't know in which context, at what time. Hard to say. They all form this giant archive of last animals. So.
Yes. Sorry, just as a point of information, how long did it take to go from? How long was the industry?
How long did
it take?
From 30 million to 1,000?
To 31 to 1,000.
About 20 years.
30 million to 1,000 in 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why it's so. And also, again, remember, this is the biggest land animal in North America. It's huge. We sold so much animal. You would see. So yeah, it's incredible. And this sort of is the sort of breaking point for what extinction means.
We have a question here, and then there, and then up at the front.
So you asked the question about whether it's not, these are atrocity pictures.
Yeah.
We're showing thousands. And I think perhaps a more productive question would be to ask, what would prevent us from seeing them as atrocity pictures?
Yeah.
And that when you ask that question, then it allows you to see all the operating assumptions of what we could call human supremacy. Right? It also would allow you to see bones of people that are supposedly inferior as not being a problem. It allows you to see all the assumptions of human supremacy come into play, which would be the filter that would prevent you from seeing that as an atrocity. and seeing it rather as a triumph, or as a victory, or as something really impressive.
But that's what the trophy shot is.
What are those assumptions? You start unpacking them, and it's just like they're merely animals, right? They don't suffer. They're killable.
Yeah.
We want their habitat. We just exterminate them. All those assumptions can start to come into play when you just switch that question around.
I mean,
Say what keeps us from seeing.
I agree. And I think, I mean, seeing, people can buy buffalo meat now. So what, the killing of animals, not, even if we see that some extinction shots or some animal deaths are atrocious, we don't say that for all. Or some would say, this is a huge question to be argued. So even the time of the image will change what sort of atrocity means to the image. I mean, I see what you're saying in many ways, but I know that, it's just, you think of the history of atrocity photographs, and when they're taken, they're rarely taken by some of the photographer who thinks this is terrible. Often they're used for other kinds of
By the camera there?
Here's one.
I have two questions about the buffalo. So one is trying to think about these images, which are essentially archives we're working with here, and to think about what ways they create a sense of guilt, and to what extent that sense of guilt can alleviate our confidence that the buffalo actually has come back. Whereas if we have, if you look at similar paintings, and I don't know if you should probably see there's passenger pictures, where there's similar descriptions of the incredible mass of passenger pigeons, the flocks taking hours and hours to fly over. But that's gone. And I mean, you sort of branded whether they're trying to bring it back, whether that's panned out or not, where they're going to live and whether they're going to drive morning does into extinction, then and so on and so on. But I mean, does that make a difference? In other words, does the ultimate thing that we know about the people who make those photographs and make those paintings, make a difference for how we look at it? And my other question is a little more indirect, and maybe there's not an answer to this, but I mean the story, there's one story I think that one immediately thinks of the buffalo searches, which is sort of modernization, sort of erasing the incredible abundance of biodiversity that there was. I mean, environmental historians have modified that story a little bit lately, right? I mean, now the thought is that 30 million buffalo itself was a historical anomaly brought about by the already previous incredible collapse of Native American populations that actually had kept the bison population in check. So that the assumption now is that actually prior was not 30 million during the year, just as the North American forests were not as extensive because of Native American burning before the 19th century. So there's a real sense in which that wilderness that we've so much criticized is itself actually an effect of the European colonization. And does that, I'm wondering, I honestly don't know the answer to this, but does that, I mean, if that turns out to be true, I mean, does it change the way we see this? I mean, this is itself, that is not like natural abundance. It is an abundance that was created by a particular historical, imperial colonizing intervention.
Yeah, it's hard to say, prior to sort of heard.
Not human, you're a kid.
Okay. Well, I would say that, so the ecology of the bison, for several reasons, by the 1850s, there are sort of more Native Americans pushing to the plains, the Cherokee, for example, famously. So hunting was increasing at some level that's, there's a replenishing rate of the bison that was still enough that it wasn't going to make a big difference until finally the sort of after the American Civil War. I'm sort of just trying to get the context. In other words, there was already a pushing of Native Americans into the Midwest that would have changed things. And I think 30 million, I mean, looking at some of the most recent sort of historical and discussion around this is probably the right number, maybe 20 million, 30 million, were consistently spread across the plains, not necessarily in these largest of herds, although they do have herd, seasonal herd activity. And they were spread much wider. Well, they were found in the New England area even. So it's a different image to have a sort of spread out population versus a sectionalized or bioregionalized population. So I guess that would sort of change things. How does it change the visual culture? I don't know. Something I'm researching right now, though, is about national frameworks. What I feel is like, at this point, all animals are nationalized by and large, right? And we just coast to it. It's a nationalization of an animal. And our laws are different than other nations' laws. Our imagery, our culture, so tiger, panda, bear, especially mammals, these sort of national frameworks are tied to the buffalo, the American buffalo, the buffalo nickel. You can't separate the bison faith from the national faith. And some of that I talked a little bit today, but I'm interested more and more how national political movement, like self-reflection, contribute to the real-time experience of extinction. This is sort of related.
I think we're running nearly close to the limit, so maybe 2 more questions. There's one in the queue here.
Brad has informed me that I'm a terrible person, so we should just stop here.
Okay.
No, it's
Well, then perhaps one more question.
I think we need to move on, unfortunately.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.